Metroid 2: Return of Samus is a game that I have an especially intimate connection with. I remember seeing this game for the first time in the 5th grade during recess. I was on the swing set and this boy next to me asked about what kind of video games I like to play. I told him that I really liked Metroid, and for once someone actually even knew what that was. That boy immediately started gushing about the Metroid game that he owned, Metroid 2 on the Game Boy. He came and found me the next day at recess and he showed me his purple Game Boy Advance with Metroid 2. He even let me borrow his cartridge, and I remember being so excited to take it home and try the game out myself. I really took my time with my first playthrough. I was largely unfamiliar with 2D Metroid, as my experience with Metroid at the time was only with Prime, Echoes, First Hunt, and a little bit of Super Metroid. A childhood friendship blossomed over our mutual enjoyment of Metroid 2, and this friend and I spent lots of time in our middle school years together. We would talk on the phone for hours nearly every day. I can remember both of us eventually getting our own copy of the game, and we'd stay in a phone call and play Metroid 2 together. We'd keep each other updated about our exact location, Metroid and missile counts, and remaining health. We'd talk about which beam we would want to use and where we'd want to explore. We'd go over every little detail. We'd also spend every single summer day being some of the only people who actually went to the public pool in our town. I remember that he and I would pretend to be Samus at the pool, wall jumping, rolling in Morph Ball, and shine sparking underwater. We'd bring our Game Boys to the pool and show each other cool secret spots and tricks like infinite bomb jumping. When I think of Metroid 2, I am reminded of those summer days as a 10-year-old with my friend. I am also reminded of many cold mornings playing my Game Boy after riding my bike to school. Metroid 2 is very closely personal to me, so much so that I have trouble fully articulating the deep-seated nostalgia that connects this game to a huge chapter of my childhood. Metroid 2 is a game that I have so much nostalgia for that I could not possibly divorce myself from those feelings in order to write an unbiased analysis. At the same time, however, I'm not sure that's something I even want in the first place. I think that many online users can concern themselves a little too much with pursuing a perfectly neutral, objective, and unbiased review when approaching discussion about a piece of media. I don't share this concern, and I think that there is equal validity in discussing media from a place of bias, passion, and nostalgia. Whether you're playing Metroid 2 for the first time, or you've been playing it constantly for many years like I have, I think there's equal validity in sharing your ideas either way. I have no doubt that I will be more kind to this game than many, and I'm sure that has at least something to do with my fond memories of growing up with this game. I will make no secret of my bias, but I hope that my points about this game are well articulated enough to hold weight at face value. Regardless of whatever history I might have with this game, my goal is to be yet another contributor to the ongoing discussion about Metroid 2. Metroid 2 isn't as disliked as the NES game, but it's still sometimes seen as somewhat of an outdated experience. Criticisms are very similar to the first Metroids in that the game suffers from cryptic design, repetitive visuals, clunky controls, and repetitive enemy encounters. Metroid 2 is also often criticized for being too linear. Especially since this game has 2 different remakes available, it's become even easier for many fans to recommend that newcomers outright skip this game in favor of either remake. I happen to think that even with these 2 excellent remakes available, there is still plenty to enjoy about this original game. I hope to use this video as an opportunity to explain what it is about Return of Samus that has me constantly revisiting it over the years. Return of Samus' story follows up on the events of the first game, with tasking Samus with yet another bounty. This time, Samus is tasked with eliminating all of the Metroids on their homeworld SR388. The manual provides a recap of the first game, and a little more information on how exactly Samus' new bounty came to be. I want to call attention to the line about the Federation's decision to exterminate the Metroids being described as unanimous and simple. So after the events of the first game, the members of the Congress of the Federation are in agreement. The Metroids absolutely must be eliminated. There's some extra information in the manual about a research team and search and rescue team as well. This never appears in-game, but I really like this extra info specifically because it is extra. Getting extra flavor text is a huge appeal for many Prime players, and even here in the second game, we get some lore from the manual. If you were like me and only had the game itself to go off of, the story quickly becomes clear just from killing your first Metroid. You'll figure out that you, Samus, are tasked with eliminating all all 39 Metroids on their homeworld. In the recap of Metroid 1, the manual reminds the player that the first stolen Metroid was stolen from a Federation research facility. The entire inciting incident of the first game came to be through bad luck, as the pirates do not actually know where Metroids are from since they never saw their homeworld. Both game manuals make this clear, and yet the Galactic Federation still orders the absolute eradication of every last Metroid. As I mentioned in my previous video, Samus's agency wasn't completely clear in the first game. Defeating the pirates and putting a stop to their evil schemes is very cut and dry in terms of morality. But here in the second game, it seems that the Metroids are simply meant to be understood as villainous abominations that simply have no place in this world. Just one of them could easily wipe out an entire planetary civilization after all. Right? I'd like to wait until later in the video to discuss the rest of this game's story, but for now, I'll say that the story lays out the context for the gameplay very well, even without the manual. The premise, despite its simplicity, gives the player a lot to think about as they progress through the game. Presentation of Metroid 2 is obviously held back by the limitations of the hardware. Game Boy games can only display 4 monochromatic colors, and the screen itself has a very low resolution. There's no getting around that on the Game Boy. But even so, I think that Metroid 2 is a good-looking Game Boy game. The sprites of this game are very large, and this allows characters like Samus and the many creatures to be drawn with more detail than their NES counterparts. Samus's sprites are an especially massive improvement over the last game, with proper proportions, and sprites that consistently keep her cannon on her right arm. The palette swap to Varia's suit of the first game can't work without color, so instead we get an entirely new set of sprites for the Varia suit. This chunkier armor looks fantastic, and stands out as some of the best sprite art in the game. The enemies in Metroid 2 have always stood out to me for being especially unique and interesting. Many are insectoid like the first game, but there are also plenty here that feel more oceanic. Tentacles, spikes, shells, and fins complete the look. Similar to insects, marine life derives fear from many players, and again, feels very alien to most people. There are a lot of cool robotic enemies in Metroid 2 as well. Like the first game, Metroid 2 again decides to give us black and empty backgrounds. This decision makes more sense on the Game Boy, especially if you've played games like Donkey Kong Land before. But even so, I feel like this game could benefit from just a little bit more detail in the backgrounds. The actual tiles for the different environments are well drawn and make for an interesting variety of stone textures. Metroid 2 can't get around looking dated just from being on the Game Boy, but within those limitations, there is an impressive detailed variety. I wouldn't call it the best looking Game Boy game, but I think this game looks good overall and manages to look better than Metroid on the NES. As far as performance is concerned, no news is good news. I've never been able to notice much of any sprite flickering, rendering errors, or slowdown. Another massive step up from the first game. Metroid 2's lower resolution does lower player visibility. It could be argued that braving a deep, dark cave full of dangerous aliens should have low visibility to heighten the fear factor. Restrictions on the player's range of vision and moveset are pretty common in horror games, such as with tank controls or dark games with flashlights. I believe that Metroid 2 is playing to the strengths of the limitations of its hardware by using that lower resolution to raise tension in your basic movement. Return of Samus may not be a horror game, but even within the limitations of the Game Boy, the developers are using elements of horror to heighten the tension and atmosphere. The game is deliberately designed around the limitations not only to enhance the gameplay, but also to characterize the game world. Even with only 4 monochromatic colors, I can't think of any other Game Boy game that uses absolute blackness as much as Metroid 2. Unlike Metroid 1, there is a bit more of a divide here in Metroid 2 between the natural and unnatural. The natural stone caves hardly contain any signs of anything alien-made. Many caves contain things like spikes, water, and vines. In many nests, you'll find bizarre plant life growing all around. Twisting vines cover the ground, spiky shrubs grow along the walls, and strange webbing is scattered across different rooms. Doors were likely removed because of the lack of color, but even so, the absence of doors in the caves further divides nature from the Chozo temples. The Chozo-made structures feature more detail as well, such as various uniquely drawn types of stone blocks and things like pipes or these strange twisting metal beams. These temples are grand and unique for being constructed within these massive open caves. Their more segmented design suggests a more sequestered lifestyle than their Zebes counterparts. Both natural and unnatural areas house lots of destructible sand tiles as well. It's often used to give the game world more texture, but monsters also sometimes hide within the sand. This much sand shows us through the environments that this world has been abandoned for a very long time, and the wind has carried sand all the way to the innermost chambers of the missing Chozo. SR388 tells us quite a bit through its natural and Chozo
Chozo inhabitants wordlessly through the environments, and it makes for compelling exploration. I'll discuss environmental storytelling more towards the end of the video, but here I'll say that SR388 does a lot to make it stand out from the many planets visited throughout the series. Metroid 2 introduces crouching and aiming down. The application of these new moves is self-explanatory. The moment-to-moment gameplay is streamlined. Samus's moveset is otherwise largely similar on paper. Samus's spin jump returns and continues to diversify platforming in general. Perhaps a combination of the lower resolution and larger sprite size contributes towards Samus feeling a bit slower in this game. Metroid 2 somehow manages to mostly avoid issues of screen crunch, and I suspect this is why Samus's general movement speed has been reduced. The lower visibility has less of a chance to be harmful to you since your movement is slower. Samus's movement speed being lowered makes sense in this context. As a result, however, this game can't help but feel like it's lacking the fast-paced, thrilling action of some of the other games in the series. This is a shift in priorities that plays to the strengths of the limitations of the hardware. It's a trade-off that sacrifices pacing to enhance the atmosphere. Despite Samus's slower movement speed, there's a tightness to her movement that feels just a bit more responsive than the first game. I don't know how exactly to describe it, but general movement feels a bit more precise. Two complaints that I do have about Samus's movement in this game are that you still cannot enter the morph ball in midair, and the space jump timing is oddly picky and demanding. Once you fall out of a spin jump, you cannot reinitiate a spin, so you're forced to sink like a rock until you land somewhere. This means that one minor mistake with the extremely picky timing can send you plunging all the way down. Many have criticized the spider ball controls over the years, saying it's slow and that the game gets confused when you're near corners. I don't like that entering the spider ball in midair kills your momentum, but beyond that, I've never really been bothered by the way it controls. Just because I am able to get used to it, that doesn't mean that the spider ball's controls aren't occasionally janky. The terrible space jump controls force many players to rely on the spider ball to get around, meaning many players are using spider ball far more often than I ever do. If it's your only viable option for traversal, then I can completely understand why so many players dislike the movement speed. Overall, however, Metroid 2's controls are a step up from the first game and are fine for what they are. The music of this game is where my place as a Metroid 2 apologist becomes most apparent. Metroid 2 decides to try something new for the series with its music, opting to focus primarily on atmosphere over melody. The title screen music, bluntly put, is unpleasant. I've never liked it. If you manage to sit through all of the irritating screeching, you'll find this ethereal part of the track. It took me a few years of playing this game to find this, and like I said in the last video, I appreciate that every Metroid game likes to do something unique with the title screen music. The world's main tunnel has one of the only melodic and upbeat tracks in the game, and it's fantastic. This is more or less where the actual level music stops. The rest of the level tracks are ambient noise, not so much actual music. These are one of the most criticized parts of this game, by far. These tracks are meant to represent scattered ambient noises made by the environments rather than act as actual music. The problem that most people seem to have with them is that they don't work as ambience and instead just sound like 8-bit pee-poop. I seriously couldn't tell you why, but these tracks just work for me. I genuinely really enjoy this ambience. It complements and enhances the game's world and atmosphere for me. They make SR388 feel ominous and creepy, and they don't take me out of the game even a little bit. I especially enjoy the theme for the Omega Nest. Despite my enjoyment of the many ambient tracks, the one track I don't enjoy so much is the theme of the Chozo temples. This track is too repetitive and droning for me. The Metroid battle music kind of just sounds like random noise. You can tell it's going for some kind of panicked frenzy. It works, but it's always stood out to me as a strange choice. The last few pieces are in the final area of the game. The final Metroid nest represents an area with incredible story significance, so the music aims to capture the creepiness of the Metroids and make you feel unwelcome in the heart of their home. Of course, the final boss, the Queen Metroid, needs a track that captures her massive and imposing presence. The subversive ending of Return of Samus is perfectly captured in my favorite track of this game, the theme of the hatchling. The ambience of this game is almost universally disliked, but I have always tremendously enjoyed the entire soundtrack of Return of Samus. The fanfares are given new renditions in this game, and a third one is introduced. The new one is a little jingle just for missile tanks, which works well for lessening the repetition of the item acquired fanfare. It makes the regular item fanfare that much more special by cutting down on too much of a good thing. Planet SR388 is not structured like Planet Zebes. As far as world design is concerned, SR388 is more linear than most games in the series. The world has one long main path that goes down and around from the start point to the end point, but this main path is full of acid that needs to be lowered. So initially, very little of that main path is actually available to the player. Increasing the linearity of the game world means that players are less likely to get lost, and thus waste less time in areas they don't need to be in. Players always have a general sense of where they need to be, since the overarching objective sets expectations about where you need to explore. The game is made more accessible, and the game is given a more evenly paced adventure. But the increased world linearity also comes with potential drawbacks. Because of the more linear world design, we're left with less pathing options overall. Macro scale navigation is less of a priority in this game, so there's less opportunity for variation on repeat playthroughs. Rather than exploring one giant interconnected maze, you're exploring around 8 segmented smaller areas. All of these connect to the main path, but none connect to each other. So as far as world design is concerned, Metroid 2 is a much more linear game than Metroid 1. Individual areas are completed in their entirety, one at a time, in a set order. For example, a player exploring Area 6 isn't going to need to go back to earlier areas in order to benefit their navigation. So the mental load that the player is meant to account for is often reset in Metroid 2. This is very much unlike the first game, but even so, I think it'd be going too far to say that Metroid 2 does not offer explorative gameplay. Metroid 2 does not offer the same kind of larger interconnected world as Zebes, but you're absolutely going to need to put your navigational skills to the test in order to find your way through SR388. Areas are sufficiently maze-like enough to confuse the player and force you to pay careful attention to your placement and traversal. Blindly pushing ahead won't work here. You're going to need to demonstrate your navigational skills to find your way through the world. In order to make progress in Metroid 2, there is a greater focus on event progression in the form of the Metroids themselves. As displayed on the pause screen, there are a set number of Metroids hidden throughout each area. Once all of the Metroids of an entire area are defeated, the acid lowers just enough to open the next area. So Metroid 2 has a tremendous focus on linear event progression, as well as an overall more linear world layout. Instead of 2 bosses in either order, players must defeat 39 Metroids in a semi-linear order. Metroid 2 places focus away from macro-scale interconnected nonlinearity in favor of this segmented world design and progression. This increased linearity allows for a greater difficulty curve, and also allows for the game to tell a bit more of a story through the environment itself about the Metroids. Metroid 2 is all about delving deeper into the planet, and the world becomes more desolate and twisted as the game continues. Smaller enemies are replaced with larger and more exotic enemies, and even deeper, there are hardly any creatures at all. This is done as well as it is specifically because of the more linear progression. This progression is designed as such to service the narrative. The narrative of Metroid 2 is told through the more linear gameplay, and I appreciate what Metroid 2 is able to do with this progression. Specific story moments are experienced in a deliberate order, such as the Metroids evolving. Tension is raised as the player gets closer and closer to 0 Metroids remaining.
Whoa.
As the Metroids become more powerful, as the environments and creatures become more dangerous, and as the aesthetics become more eerie. All of this is cohesively designed around the more linear progression. For all of its benefits, this progression also introduces potential drawbacks. Many fans have a tremendous issue with too much linearity in Metroid, and this is because a more planned path through the world means that there's less opportunity for navigational variation, as I previously went over. There's also less incentive to sequence breaks, since players are going to need to defeat every Metroid regardless of how many items they decide to skip. Item progression in general is slightly more linear overall. Sequence breaking aside, you're going to need bombs, ice beam, spider ball, and space jump. Items increase your explorative opportunity, but again, this is done on a per area basis. For example, collecting space jump in area 3 does not open any new pathways in areas 1 or 2. It's a more immediate style of item progression. Once you get space jump and finish area 3, none of the following items nor areas will ask you to assess the item logic to benefit your navigation. So while item progression is a greater focus here than in the first game, it still isn't very much of a focus. There aren't very many progression items, and there aren't that many areas that ask you to return with a new item. There are plenty of optional items, such as the 3 other beam weapons, high jump, various suit, and screw attack. All of these are beneficial in one way or another, but once again, players are forced to hold only one beam weapon at a time. So progression overall has undeniably shifted in its priorities, but I can't really call it better or worse, merely different. Sequence breaking in Metroid 2 is somewhat of an oddity in the Metroid series. You can of course skip all of the optional items, but sequence breaking also allows you to skip spider ball and space jump. If you're going for a low percent run, the only required items are bombs, ice beam, and 1 energy tank. Skipping spider ball and space jump both require constant use of a trick called infinite bomb jumping, or IBJs. IBJ is a hidden technique found in most 2D Metroid games that allows you to ascend infinitely. The timing can be tricky, but you must place bombs in a specific rhythm to reach areas otherwise inaccessible. This trick is used to bypass traversal abilities, such as spider ball or space jump. The infinite bomb jump is nearly constantly required once you use it to decide to skip the spider ball, so you better be really good at it if you want to try skipping progression items. This trick is fun to master and makes for a creative utilization of your moveset and arsenal. Experimentation and skill are rewarded with learning to perform this trick. IBJs as a concept are exactly everything I love about intuiting sequence breaks. One thing I really like about Metroid 2 is that this game trusts the player to accept the consequences of their actions. They could have found a way to force you to collect certain items, but instead they give the player the freedom to challenge themselves as much or as little as they please. Beyond that, sequence breaking doesn't actually save you any time. Even speedrunners don't bother skipping much of anything, as there really isn't much of a time save for skipping many of the items. Reordering items is also not incentivized through Metroid 2's world and progression design. I suppose you could, theoretically, arrange the ordering of many items, but there's almost no intrinsic or extrinsic reason to do so. If you're passing by where an item is, why not just pick it up while you're there? Sequence breaking overall hasn't been expanded on very much in Metroid 2. Metroid 2's navigational challenge is streamlined through the segmented level design and progression, but the player is tasked with doing more to make progress. As previously discussed, the mental load that the player is meant to account for is often reset by the segmented world. Metroid 2's segmented map design means that you're hardly backtracking on a larger scale in this game in order to make progress. You might do all kinds of backtracking through individual areas, but you won't need to go from, say, Area 6 back to Area 2 in order to make progress. Some players value a game world that forces lots of backtracking because it makes your navigation feel more slapdash or scattered, and thus less video gamey. That kind of world design certainly offers its own separate appeal, but here in Metroid 2, we got something that also comes with its own benefits. Backtracking within each area is common, but their small size means that there's less backtracking overall. Players are free to backtrack whenever they please, but again, the segmented world design and progression mean that there's very little incentive to do so. The game is streamlined, and the pacing is more even to suit the pick-up and play style of the portable Game Boy. The lack of backtracking lends itself well to the game's feeling of forward momentum as you delve further into the planet as well. Because the game is designed with a great focus on event progression over item progression and segmented world design, your progress feels more mission-focused than most other Metroid games. The greater focus on the actual mission enhances the narrative, but it also draws a lot of criticism from many members of the community. The free-form exploration of other games, such as Metroid NES, was a defining feature of Metroid. Some feel that this change of focus is too much of a deviation from what Metroid is really about, and thus makes Metroid 2 somewhat of an outlier in the series. I can agree that Metroid 2 is certainly unique, but I'd argue that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I believe that Metroid 2 is every bit as much of a Metroid game as any of the others. One thing I can't defend, however, is the continued lack of any map feature. This needlessly complicates progression. Since the level layouts are more varied, this at least doesn't sting as bad as it did in Metroid 1. There are a crowd of players that actually prefer these games to not provide you with a map. I can't agree with this sentiment, but I just wanted to mention that I recognize the validity of this preference. Coming off of the heels of Metroid 1, Return of Samus's level design is a tremendous breath of fresh air. Metroid 2 expectedly manages to far surpass the level design of the first game, with more varied and interesting level layouts. Secret destructible tiles are placed in more intuitive and interesting ways, and platforming is far more varied. Metroid 2 is notable for having many large and expansive rooms, which is an interesting choice with this game also having such a zoomed-in screen. The limited visibility, combined with the larger rooms, enhances the claustrophobic atmosphere of the world through the gameplay. It's almost like walking around in the dark in a massive room with a small light. There's a specific flavor of liminality that Metroid 2 captures through its presentation that is complemented by the level design. The larger caves that house the ancient Chozo structures contrast nicely against the many winding, cramped tunnels of Metroid 2. These smaller tunnels never amount to much beyond running and occasionally avoiding and dispatching enemies. Outdoor cave areas are irregularly shaped, providing a more naturalistic feel. Inside of the actual temples, you'll find level design that resembles alien-made architecture, as well as various robotic enemies and many platforms. Metroid 2 is diversifying the world through the layout of each room as a believable and logical space. It's impressive for Game Boy, and you can tell that they've done everything they could within those limitations to make the world feel interesting and convincing as an abandoned civilization. Metroid 2 might be a more linear game overall, but I personally would much rather explore a more interesting world that happens to be linear than explore a less interesting world that happens to be non-linear. Exploration and linearity are certainly closely connected, but this is not a zero-sum game. A less linear world is not necessarily more interesting, nor is a more linear world necessarily less interesting. Metroid 2 demonstrates this with so much more going on in its world that I strongly prefer exploring it over Metroid 1's Zebes because there is so much more to see and do on SR388. It may not be as colorful or as non-linear, but by every other metric, I believe Metroid 2's level design is far superior. I like how in the Spider Ball room, you can see the Chozo temple beginning to fall apart and bleed into the walls of the cave. Certain Chozo statue rooms are sealed away within the dilapidated buildings, and you have to tunnel in or go through a sand pit just to get inside. The level design is telling us a story about the world itself. As nice as this is, I do believe that Metroid 2 still has quite a lot of basic hallway design that doesn't really stand out as especially memorable. The gameplay doesn't actually amount to much more than their NES counterparts. Many vertical shafts, again, are just your basic scattered platforms with enemies sprinkled in. At least here in Metroid 2, these are merely parts of a larger and more varied game world. Metroid 2 manages to blow the first game's level design out of the water with a far more diverse landscape, and lots more going on in individual rooms overall. Mechanically speaking, most rooms have a more deliberate placement of platforms, as well as more unique rooms to better make use of Morph Ball, bombs, and Spider Ball. Rooms utilize enemy placement in a more thoughtful way, especially with these wall fires placed alongside various platforming challenges or enemies specifically placed to obstruct your platforming. Carefully examining this game's level design for this video has made me realize that Metroid 2 does actually fall victim to numerous design issues that I had with the first game. I'm shocked about how often this game repeats level layouts because it hasn't ever felt particularly repetitive to me. But examining a map has shown me that there is actually quite a bit of repetition, though not nearly as much as the first game. The repeated platform layouts and many winding basic tunnels both make Metroid 2's level design sometimes feel underwhelming. It's a massive step up from the first game, but I think that's a low bar to clear. They suffer from similar design issues, but Metroid 2 has so much more going on that it feels like it averages out to being good, but not great. SR388 seems to be built with a greater focus on making the level design feel real in a sense, but this just doesn't make for consistently mechanically interesting levels. Level design in Metroid 2 is not among my favorites in the series, but it's still well done overall and impressive, at least for Game Boy. Combat in Metroid 2 is another considerable step up from the first game. Of course, Samus's expanded moveset streamlines enemy encounters and makes for more satisfying moment-to-moment gameplay. A few enemies demonstrate new behaviors, such as various new projectiles, taking cover behind armor, spawning swarms, blasting streams of fire, vulnerability only to bombs, new movement patterns, enemies hiding within the floors and walls, or new platform creatures. Some enemies behave very similarly to creatures from the first game, such as Autoads, Gaurons, and Mohiques. A greater variety of enemy behaviors slightly enhances the combat, but unfortunately the Metroid encounters leave a lot to be desired. The Alphas do nothing except slowly fly towards you and get bounced around by missiles. Gammas will use this lightning move to block missiles, but otherwise similarly fly towards you. Zetas cannot be hurt from below, and will occasionally spit fireballs and swoop down towards you. Omega Metroids are mechanically identical to Zetas, but hit harder. Shooting them in the back will do extra damage, so the Omega Metroids at least have some degree of strategy involved, though not much. All of these mentioned forms are mechanically similar to fights like Kraid and Ridley from the first game. Unfortunately, I don't think the new Metroid battles offer much of any interesting gameplay for the player. That's especially unfortunate because that means there are a whopping 38 Metroid encounters that, again, feel like Rock'em Sock'em robots. There's hardly much to do here beyond attempting to keep the Metroids away from you with carefully timed and placed missiles. You can time your shots carefully and position yourself in an advantageous location. They do have movement patterns like the Zetas and Omegas swooping around, so there is just a bit of strategy involved with positioning yourself optimally. Another thing that helps keep the Metroid encounters interesting is that you will often face Metroids in a variety of level layouts. Some rooms have you fighting Metroids in sand pits, long vertical shafts with spiky shrubs, rooms with ledges, rooms filled with webs, rooms with many platforms, rooms with cover areas, and more. This variety adds more variation to the fights than you might initially suspect. All of those features place the individual fights slightly above Kraid and Ridley, but the fact that you must fight so many of them makes it far more repetitive than it needs to be. The focus on these Metroids is a massive part of this game, so it's especially regrettable that these encounters themselves are not more interesting overall. The Zetas and Omegas being able to fly means that your rate of fire is cut down considerably. Combine that with their higher damage and health pool, and you're in for a repetitive and monotonous experience. I can at least give most of these encounters credit by saying that the majority of them go by quickly. Regular Metroids return in this game, and they are once again one of the more interesting encounters of the game. Metroids are perhaps at their most dangerous here in this game because of the zoomed-in screen. Once again, you must be careful with proceeding forward, as the Metroids are very quick and decisive with their movement. It's mostly more of the same when it comes to the design of the Metroids, but that's great since they were well designed to begin with. The Queen Metroid is the best fight in the series so far, but that's not saying much. She'll spit projectiles towards you in a specific pattern, or she'll extend her neck towards you to ram you with her head. Sometimes when the queen rams her head towards you, she'll do so with her mouth open. Firing a missile at her open mouth will freeze her in place and allow you to morph ball inside towards her stomach. Placing bombs inside of her does extraordinary damage. I don't know how anyone was supposed to figure out that you can even do that, but somehow I figured it out when I first played. This boss only has 2 attacks and isn't terribly interesting, but it's at least engaging enough to stand out when compared to any other boss from these first 2 games. For the first time in the Metroid series, a boss rewards discovering hidden techniques to deal extra damage. There is finally more to a boss fight than trading blows back and forth, and for that I owe the Queen Metroid at least some credit. Even so, she's hardly close to what would come in future titles. reveals. As with all of the other fights in the game, the player has the option to leave the boss room at any time. This is likely because Metroids can only be damaged with missiles. This is a band-aid solution to a problem that didn't need to exist in the first place. I see nothing to gain from making Metroids immune to all beam weapons. It hurts combat because running out of missiles means you have to leave and go all the way back to some recharge station. It doesn't play into resource management in any interesting way. It just wastes the player's time. I can at least appreciate that being able to leave the Metroid encounters at any time serves thematic purpose, as Samus is the aggressor, invading what is simply a creature's home rather than a boss room. It makes the encounters feel less gamey and feel more destructive. But this would have been just as possible with beam weapons dealing damage to Metroids. Missiles are de-incentivized even further in Metroid 2 because you have to save them for the Metroids. If you lose too much health or ammo while hunting Metroids, you have to turn back to recharge. Enemies are frustratingly still very stingy with health and ammo drops in Metroid 2 as well. Metroids should have dropped health or ammo, or recharge stations should have been more common, but as it is now, it's at least not as bad as Metroid 1's horrendous grind. Combat overall is unfortunately a low point for Metroid 2. Its more linear structure would lend itself well to more deliberately designed combat, but the Game Boy just didn't seem up for the task. Enemies are serviceable, but the Metroid encounters are mechanically uninteresting and fail to capitalize on their potential. The incredible repetition makes for a tiresome core gameplay loop, and that is easily the greatest criticism to be made of Return of Samus. I can understand why some people point to this criticism to explain why they can't stand this game. This issue clearly affects some more than others, because I hardly find the repetition to be bothersome. Similar to Metroid 1, much of the repetition can be cut by optimizing your gameplay. Being as familiar with Metroid 2 as I am, I'm able to keep a healthy stock of missiles and health, and I can route my path through the world efficiently to cut down on backtracking. Knowing where all of the secret refill stations are makes it possible to route your pathing so that you can place those refills along your way to the next Metroid. I can even clear the infamous Omega Nest just by stocking up on resources and becoming good enough at the battles. There isn't much, but there is some amount of strategy and variation at play with the Metroids. Health and ammo are finally rechargeable, but these resources absolutely must be preserved to be spent only on the Metroid encounters. Combat could be worse, but it's the fatal flaw for many for a reason. I wanted to save the second part of my discussion of Return of Samus' story for later in the video, so tasking the player character with killing dozens of creatures simply residing in their home absolutely should make the player feel uncomfortable. Every time you encounter a Metroid, they're simply hanging out where they live. How could they be this incredible threat to galactic peace if nobody knows about their homeworld and they're not doing anything wrong? They aren't down here scheming to dominate the galaxies, nor were they in the first game. The pirates use the Metroids as a tool, but the Metroids themselves are just animals. That comes to the forefront in Metroid 2 by removing the space pirates from the equation, and showing you that Metroids by themselves have no such desires. Metroid 2 forces you to stop thinking about the narrative as a simple game and to consider your actions from a new perspective. Metroid 2 is weaponizing the decisive morality of the first game's story and flipping that narrative on its head. Is murdering Metroids a necessary evil in order to achieve galactic peace? There is a case to be made that Samus' orders are justified, but there's also a case to be made that they are, both literally and figuratively, overkill. The space pirates clearly don't know where the Metroids are, otherwise they'd have already had their hands on more. But at the same time, what is the risk in allowing the Metroids to remain as they are? The Federation feels strongly that whatever that risk may be, it's not a risk worth taking. Just getting to the final area has this long empty cave, which is actually one of my favorite moments of the game. The Metroid counter is down to 1, and tension is building more and more as you run further down this winding pathway. You have to go so far to reach your final destination, and that carries this feeling of being completely far away from anything else. Upon arriving at the final area of the game, the player can find this one Chozo statue in this giant underground building. This statue's severed hand holds the ice beam, and the entire head is torn off and discarded off the ledge. This one room is a great example of peak environmental storytelling. The destroyed statue holding the ice beam tells us a lot without the use of any words at all. For one, the Chozo were clearly connected to the Metroids in some way. Only 39 Metroids exist on the entire planet, and all of them are concentrated here in this one segment of the planet. This one location also happens to be the spot where the Chozo settlement remains. So that, combined with this clear indication of aggression, indicates that the Metroids were in direct conflict with the Chozo. The Chozo possess the weakness of the Metroids, and the Metroids are intelligent enough to identify their vulnerability and act strategically. So this draws not only a direct connection between the Metroids and the Chozo, but specifically describes a conflict. No Chozo remain, and yet the Metroids are thriving well enough to be one of the only living things in this area. The final areas are largely devoid of any life outside of the Metroids, which perhaps does hint that the Metroids are dangerous to the wildlife of the planet. The entire final area has unique architecture that hints towards the possibility of the Metroids once being bred or created here by the Chozo themselves. There is so much to speculate on here, such as the origin of the Metroids and what exactly may have caused the Chozo to vanish. As you play through Metroid 2, both Samus and hopefully the player are left conflicted about the events of this game. Samus does not actually show any conflict until the very end of the game, however. The very next room after defeating the Queen Metroid houses a Metroid egg. This egg hatches, and the larva imprints on Samus right away. Instead of attacking like a vicious monster, it floats around her, making little chirping noises. This is where the conflict of the narrative comes to a head. You are faced with a direct example of absolute innocence right after what, at best, could be considered a highly morally questionable mission. Despite everything that Samus had just done, the larva forces her and the player to reconsider your thoughts about what a Metroid might be. Are they as terrible and destructive as the Federation described in the game manual? The game gives you nothing but empty hallways with basic platforming, as well as these otherwise indestructible blocks, if not for the larva Metroid. This gives you time to reflect on everything you've seen and done in the first two games. The larva helping you back to your ship further reinforces that the larva is actively helpful and not some abomination. Did Samus need to kill the Metroids? Were the Metroids truly evil? In addition to all of this, Samus as a character is explored through this interaction as well. As mentioned in my previous video, Samus's agency was defined by her mission in the first game, and the same thing is true in this game as well. This is a defining moment for our player character. Her disobeyal of her orders defines her own agency as separate from that of the Federation. Samus's compassion in this moment will certainly have tremendous ramifications in the sequels. One Metroid is all it took to start the entire conflict in the first place, and Samus has disobeyed her orders to save this larva Metroid's life. You are left to ponder all of this during this walk back to the ship, which in itself is a notable subversion of expectations of a Metroid game's ending. Every Metroid game ends with a bombastic action set piece, usually a daring escape as the area is about to explode. Never before or since has a Metroid game ended with a peaceful walk to your ship, especially with a companion character helping you clear the way. So this moment has incredible narrative ramifications for the entire Metroid series, and this game's story as a whole manages to pull all of this off completely wordlessly. The tragic fate of the Metroid species is told through the environments and the more linear progression, world design, and navigation. The story of Metroid 2 is a simple but very compelling exploration of the morality surrounding the different factions of the universe, with Samus caught in the middle. Conventions from the first game, such as Samus's choice in occupation, the decisive ethics, and the bombastic explosive ending, are all turned on their head in a compelling way to make the player question the events of the story. It's all the more impressive that, again, they managed to do all of this on the Game Boy without any dialogue. Metroid 2's pivotal ending enhances and recontextualizes everything that has led to that moment and catches you off guard in the best way. Much of Return of Samus's increased linearity was in service of this narrative. The story told in Metroid 2 is so good that I am left more than satisfied with the trade-off. There are 22 missile tanks and 6 energy tanks scattered across SR388. Unfortunately, there is once again no item percentage tracker nor any map to indicate the presence of items. This has tremendous consequences on the communication between player and game. A player has no way of knowing if they're near an item, no way of knowing how many total items are even out there, and no way of tracking which items they do and do not have. How are you supposed to win a race if you have no way of knowing where the finish line is? So once again, players are forced to resort to guides just to understand their goals. So accounting for your progress is fumbled, but actually searching for the expansions is much more interesting. Metroid 2 places a good 8 or so missile tanks out in the open, but this is somewhat of a necessary evil. Since Metroids can only be damaged by missiles, and there are dozens of Metroids, the game has to be sure that the player has at least some missiles to work with. So these specific missile placements aren't mechanically interesting, but they do work as a small environmental story. I've always suspected that these missiles are meant to be stored inside of some kind of Chozo armory, which works well for further realizing this temple as an actual place with history. Most of the other tanks are hidden in more interesting ways. Metroid 2 uses fake tiles a lot more than Metroid 1, and this makes it easier for players to accidentally stumble into a secret. Spider-balling up a wall might have you accidentally entering said wall, accidentally discovering the secret. A few tanks are outright shown to the player, but they sit on the other side of a wall. It's up to the player to make sense of the placement of the neighboring rooms in order to determine how exactly to reach that expansion. A few items are placed in hidden little spots here and there that simply require you to be observant, but a few are also placed behind tiles that you aren't likely to check unless you really go out of your way to bomb everywhere. Metroid 2's destructible tiles have to be destroyed by bombs. Beam weapons no longer work, so this means that checking different spots requires more deliberation and more time. The fortunate thing is that none of these especially well-hidden items are required to beat the game. It's just expansions. Unfortunately, I once again have to say that players are kind of forced but choosing between the obtuse experience without a guide and the hand-holding experience with a guide. Neither are especially satisfying for me. While item placement is far more interesting than the first game, I don't think the expansions are that much more exciting. A step above Metroid NES, but still largely average. Since this game has you scouring every corner anyways for each Metroid, pathing doesn't change much when you're going for 100%. One great thing about Metroid 2's expansions is that each of them can be collected on your first visit to any given area, so there's no endgame item hunt if you don't want one. If you've played the sequels, then you might know that this is quite the rarity. One unfortunate thing about the expansions is that there are absolutely none of them in the many tunnels of the world. They're almost always placed near the large Chozo buildings or inside of them. This means that a considerable amount of the world is devoid of expansions and thus less interesting to explore. These tunnels were already rather plain, but no expansions means there's almost nothing to do in them except platforming, walking, and shooting enemies. 100%ing this game isn't so bad if you know how many expansions you're looking for, and if you know to stick near the Chozo structures, but there is definitely plenty of room for improvement here as well. The completionist experience might be a step up from the first game, but the speedrunning experience is unfortunately largely a step backwards. This is an unfortunate consequence of the navigational design of Return of Samus. Having to kill every last Metroid means that there's hardly any opportunity for skipping much of anything for save time. Since you have to visit and kill every Metroid in each area, there really isn't much of an opportunity to optimize your routing or skip much of anything. Skipping many items is possible, but very little of it is likely to save you any time. Even the current world record speedrun of this game grabs optional items like Jump Ball, Variasuit, and Spider Ball. These can all be skipped for low percent runs, but as far as the speedrun is concerned, grabbing nearly everything is the fastest way through. Metroid NES had moments in which you needed to choose whether or not to sacrifice time in order to get specific items to make your run easier, such as Varia and High Jump. But here in Metroid 2, there's far less of this. Fewer speedrunning optimization opportunities is inherent to this kind of focus on event progression. You can still plan out your pathing within each area, and you can execute on your movement and kill the Metroids faster. Preserving your health and ammo to cut down on the need to backtrack to recharge stations does play into speedrunning. Speedrunning most any game can be a lot of fun, but Metroid 2 doesn't offer the same opportunities for route optimization, nor much of any chance to sequence break to save time. I'd like to take a moment at the end here to offer my thoughts on the subject of Metroid 2's linear design. I spent a good amount of time identifying multiple ways that Metroid 2 changes its priorities from those in the first game. I know that many players have their own idea about what Metroid should and shouldn't be. I believe that Metroid 2's gameplay is potentially less interesting because of its more linear design, but I also believe that this game is every bit as valid as a Metroid game as any other game in the series. Something like Metroid NES's gameplay style might be someone's preferred experience between the two, and Metroid 2 does have design issues that derive from its linear progression. Even with that said, I want this series to continue trying new ideas such as this. People are certainly welcome to have their preferences, but I don't think more linear games like Metroid 2 are being untrue to Metroid's quote-unquote core. You might not agree with what Metroid 2 has to offer, but Metroid as a series is so varied that I can't agree with criticizing Metroid 2 simply for being more linear at all. Linearity as a concept is present in every Metroid game to some extent. It feels arbitrary to attempt to separate Metroid games between the supposed true Metroid games and the fakes. Metroid 2 gets by on the excuse that it's a portable game, but I don't think that Metroid 2 even needs an excuse to be more linear. I don't subscribe to this mindset that the more linear games in Metroid need to go out of their way to justify their mere existence. They could and should exist just because they're good Metroid games. As long as a more linear Metroid game is playing to the strengths of its more linear design, then it's a good Metroid game as far as I'm concerned. Really, all of this is just to say that more linear games like Metroid 2 have just as much validity as the more non-linear games like Metroid NES. I touched on this contentious topic topic in my last video, and I'm familiar with the many online debates surrounding this idea. I think it's important to recognize the subjectivity surrounding this topic. It's fine if you love or hate the more linear Metroid games, but I'm just saying that Metroid as a series doesn't owe you any one specific design philosophy. As early as the very first sequel, the series has been committing to offering various amounts and types of linearity in each game. I hope I've made it clear by now, but increased linearity comes with many potential benefits and drawbacks. Metroid 2: Return of Samus pushed the series forward in many ways, but it also left some strong design aspects from the first game behind in doing so. Metroid 2's world is far more committed to world building and variety, and it probably does this as well as it could on the Game Boy. With that said, much of the moment-to-moment gameplay, such as the combat and platforming, still feel primitive when compared to the rest of the series. As a game, I think it's understandable that so many could feel rather unenthused about Metroid 2, but to me, Metroid 2 manages to be even better than the first game, but I still don't think it's especially mechanically engaging. Nearly every facet of this game's design is focused on building its world and telling the story of the extermination of the Metroids through the gameplay. Never has a Metroid game captured that feeling of braving a dark and creepy alien world quite like this. For a lot of fans, Metroid isn't necessarily about any one gameplay style or mechanical design. Metroid is also about a specific feeling of being isolated in a dangerous and eerie alien world. As far as narrative and game feel are concerned, I think Metroid 2 is peak Metroid. But in terms of moment-to-moment gameplay and mechanical depth, I believe Metroid 2 is better than the first game in a lot of ways, but not particularly special when compared to most games in the genre. Metroid 2 has more emotional, narrative, and atmospheric appeal than it does any gameplay or strategy. Metroid 2 fumbles its Metroid encounters pretty hard, which has earned it somewhat of a divisive reputation amongst fans. It may have failed to make the combat more interesting through its linear design, but the world building, atmosphere, and narrative are all excellent, not in spite of the linear design, but specifically because of it. Metroid 2 is a flawed game, but also a resounding success in pushing the series forward in gameplay, presentation, narrative, and much more. This game knows exactly what it wants to be, and it achieves its goals by playing to the strengths of the Game Boy's hardware. Metroid 2 is not only a fantastic sequel to Metroid 1, but also just a great Metroid game in its own right. Return of Samus does not replace the first game, but it stands alongside and complements its design with a unique and equally valid flavor of Metroid. I constantly revisit this game, and I am certain that I will continue to do so in the future. Thank you for watching my video about Metroid 2: Return of Samus.